we haven't really got to give Robert his credit. He was actually a very accomplished man in life. I mean, you just mentioned he was Garfield's Secretary of War. Um, so what's sort of his life? I mean, he's a very accomplished man. How does he grapple with the legacy of his father? Because that's there's got to be there's got to be a psychological term for sons and descendants of great men, like this complex, this like maybe inferiority complex they have.
Yeah, that's one of the stories out there about Robert that I don't know if I believe it or not because of who wrote it. But yeah, Robert's a fascinating guy, which is why I wrote. I spent 10 years writing a book on him. But yeah, so he was a lawyer. He eventually became one of the biggest lawyers in Chicago in the Midwest. He was Secretary of War for Garfield and Arthur. He became minister to Great Britain under President Harrison, and then he became the president of the Pullman Car Company. And when he switched over to business side rather than law, he was president or board member or chairman of the board of numerous companies, always cutting edge, telephone companies, car companies, um, railroad companies. And so he was a self-made multimillionaire. He was truly a captain of industry at the time, along with Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan. He was with all those guys at the time. But among all that, Robert was the last living Lincoln. And so, yeah, he was the keeper of his father's legacy and, of course, all of his father's papers and heirlooms and things. So, Robert had to deal with that every day of his life. And there was one person who wrote a story saying that Robert did live under an inferiority complex. The quote supposedly is like Robert said to him, nobody wanted me for Secretary of War. They wanted Abraham Lincoln's son. Nobody wanted me for Minister to Great Britain. They wanted Abraham Lincoln's son. I don't know. As I said, I don't believe the source. I don't know that Robert would have said that in general or even to the guy who wrote it down. But I mean, there's no doubt Robert became Secretary of War because he was his father's son. That's why Garfield nominated him. But Robert did such a good job that then, he became Minister to Great Britain. He did such a good job that people began to see he is a smart, intelligent, worthy guy, and he's also Abraham Lincoln's son. So definitely people traded on his name for him at first. He never traded on it. There's tons of letters where he gets offered every position you could think of, and he pretty much says no all the time. He's saying, I have a family, I have a law practice, but more than that, anybody who's if I took this job, anybody would say, why does he deserve that job? He has no experience. It just doesn't make any sense. So, yeah, I think, now, of course, I could be wrong. Maybe he did. But, back then, he was a Victorian era guy. So they didn't, he's not going to write a letter spouting off all of his insecurities, at least not that I've ever found.
What's the one story where he was playing golf and someone came up to him and was asking him questions about Lincoln and he said, "My father was a great man, but I am not."
Yeah, that's one of my favorites. There's a picture that I found. I found it in a newspaper. I've never found the original, but yeah, he was golfing in Georgetown at a golf course in Georgetown because he had a house later in life. So Robert lived in Chicago for I don't know 50 years or so. Then he had his summer home in Vermont, and eventually they sold their Chicago house and they bought a house in Georgetown, Washington D.C. And so Robert was an avid golfer, and so one day he was sitting on a bench. This is the photo. He's sitting on a bench, got a golf club in his lap and a cigar in his hand. He was a huge cigar smoker. So to me, this picture just kind of encapsulates him as a person. But yeah, a reporter came up to him and wanted to ask him all these questions. And yeah, Robert finally said, listen, my father was a great man. I am not. And he got up and walked away because he got tired of people always wanting to write about him. And that's what, Robert only twice or three times maybe in his whole life did he ever stand up and speak about his father. He always said, it's not my place. Let the historians and the writers and the poets do it. It's not my place to say things, which I appreciate. But I also think part of it too is that I don't think he wanted himself he didn't want to kind of impinge himself onto his father's legacy, you know. Like a good example is when he was president of the Pullman Car Company, the black porters wanted to get a raise in their wages. And actually, I'm sorry, no, let me back up. Before that happened, um, Booker T. Washington and I think W.E.B. Du Bois, they approached Robert about him, that's what it was, allowing blacks to ride in the white cars. And Robert basically said, no, yeah, I'm a businessman. I'm not interested in your politics. I'm not going to worry about it. And of course, they called him racist, and people still do call him racist. I call him a businessman. But also, you know, I have to wonder, and so some people have told me that I'm looking too deeply into this, but I have to wonder, like, his father freed the slaves. If Robert had suddenly come out as the first millionaire businessman to desegregate all of his train cars. This was in the 1920s, 19 teens, excuse me. You know, where would that have put him and his reputation? Would his suddenly, you talk about Abraham Lincoln, you talk about how his son desegregated cars in the 19 teens. You know, I don't know. Did Robert even want to be lumped in there? His father had his own legacy. Robert didn't want to jump into it. So, yeah, I can even imagine how complicated his life was as the heir of Lincoln, let alone everything else he did in his life.
I mean, to sort of relate it to others, this thread of commonality that a lot of, sons and daughters of great men, they want nothing to do with it. They want to create. Psychology is so interesting because, for example, if your dad's an alcoholic, some people might be an alcoholic, some people might not. Some people who are sons of great men are kind of spoiled by that and they play into it and they're this aristocrat. But some of them want absolutely nothing to do with it and they want to be their own man and create their own legacy. So it's interesting to analyze that. But you say that, his the mainstream narrative around Robert Lincoln is that he was this horrible person, but you obviously disagree with that. So can you speak to that?
There's really a couple of specific reasons why Robert has such a negative reputation throughout history. Um, a lot of Lincoln scholars just ignore him and they don't think he's worth anything. And they think that he has nothing to say about his father, so you know he doesn't interest them because it doesn't help them in their historical work, which I understand. Um, but I think that was a choice Robert made. You know, as in May 1865, he wrote a letter to historian Josiah Hyland, and Holland wanted to say, "Can you tell me everything you remember about your dad? I'm writing a book." And Robert said, "Well, you know, I was at college during the war. I was never around. I really don't remember anything." But you talk to these friends of his, and as I noticed as I was working on this book for so many years, Robert knew a lot about his father, and he wrote about it all the time in letters to friends and colleagues and things. But he didn't write a book, and he never wrote articles because he didn't want to be the target of everybody. Oh, Robert, let's go to Robert, which they did anyways. But so I think that was a calculated decision on his part. But really, Robert Lincoln, it's very interesting because he was when he was younger, when his father was alive. Robert was a great storyteller, just like his father. He was a hilarious jokester, just like his father, and he was very fun and lively, the life of the party, just like his father. After the assassination, Robert is no longer like that for obvious reasons. But then, even when his sadness wears away, he becomes very shy and reticent. And because everyone's just, if you think about Robert, one thing I always tell people, I'm like, think about it. Every single day of his life, people were badgering him about his father. They want information, they want trinkets, they want letters, they want signatures, they want you to look at a work of art they created, they want you to look at something they wrote. It's just, it never ended for him for 60 years. And so he just didn't like talking about it. But as he got older, he hated the press because he felt like the press got everything wrong. Half of it because they were idiots, and half of it because they just made it up. And so Robert wouldn't talk to them because they would just make it up. So because he wouldn't talk to them, the reporters would just make it up. And so because they made it up, he wouldn't talk to them. So it's just this vicious circle. And so he tons of negative publicity about him, especially as he got older and was a millionaire captain of industry, because journalists didn't like him because he didn't like them. Another big reason is that Robert, he was a corporate attorney before he became a corporate leader. And so a lot of people then and now say, oh, he's so unlike his father. Oh, he's Abraham Lincoln was a man of the people. Robert's just a rich prick. No, he's so unlike his father. And I disagree with you. Abraham Lincoln was a corporate attorney too. People forget that. He worked for the railroad. He got a $5,000 fee one day. So I think Robert turned into exactly the person his father wanted him to be, a highly successful, respected lawyer and businessman. But, that's what we were talking about earlier, the legend of Lincoln. Oh, Lincoln's this everyman who never cared about money or fame or success. Like, no, that wouldn't make him human, you know.
And I can't imagine how frustrating and annoying it would be to go through your whole life constantly being badgered by journalists and authors and historians.
Yeah, and they would ask him things all the time. Well, what do you think your father would say about this? What do you think your father would say about this? And and then you can imagine. So by 1909, which is the centennial of Abraham Lincoln's birth, Robert would receive. Oh, I think I read this in one of his letters. I don't remember somewhere. He would receive 50 or 100 letters a day, and he answered all of them. I mean, his secretary answered most of them, but he responded to all of them because he felt like it was his duty as the heir of his father, the keeper of the legacy. But can you imagine that, just getting 50 letters a day that you felt compelled to answer, all about your father, some of which he could answer, some of which he couldn't, some of which he didn't want to. And most of his letters say, okay, well, yeah, here's the answer to your question, but listen, this is not for publication. This is not for a book. This is not for you to use. This is just for your information. And please keep it that way. Don't mention my name. Don't tell anybody I gave it to you. Because he didn't want to be, again, he didn't want to be part of that. He wanted to help, but not be on the
Mhm.
pedestal himself.
Yeah. Well, that's noble. But I mean, speaking of legacy, something that's pretty unfortunate that I learned is there's actually no Lincoln descendants alive today. Um, can you speak to that? Because it's actually kind of sad to me because I think one of our responsibilities as humans is to carry on our ancestors' legacy and carry on our family name and reproduce. I think that's ultimately why we're here is to reproduce. So it kind of does sadden me that there's no Lincoln descendants alive today.
Yeah, it's a sad story. So after three of Abraham Lincoln's four children died, so Robert got married, and he had three children. He had two girls and a boy, and his son was Abraham Lincoln II. They called him Jack, and he was, by all accounts, kind of a reincarnation of Abraham Lincoln. He was brilliant. He was empathetic. He was, everything that Abraham Lincoln was, and which was how Robert was kind of raising him to be. Robert was raising him to be an attorney, go to Harvard like Robert did. They'd have a law practice together, father and son, and maybe politics. Who knows? Robert didn't want politics, but his son might. But when Robert was minister to Great Britain, Jack was 17 years old, and he had a carbuncle under his arm, basically a cyst. And the doctors kept cutting it open to drain the blood, which, back then, drain the blood out, that makes everything all better, right? So basically, they kept cutting him open, and ultimately, he got blood poisoning and he died when he was 17 years old. And so Robert was devastated, of course. And that was when he turned from law to business, because he said, I was in the law for my son, and he's not here anymore. So then Robert had two daughters left. His oldest daughter had one son. His name was Abraham Lincoln Isham, and he went by Link. And then his younger daughter, Jessie, she had two children, Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith and Mary Lincoln Beckwith. They called her Peggy. And Robert Lincoln Beckwith, they called him Bud. They loved nicknames in the Lincoln family. And all three of the Lincoln grandchildren did not have children. As far as we can tell, all of it was purposefully that they did not have children. Um, we know that if you read their letters and things, all three of them hated being Lincolns. They felt like sideshow freaks. Like, oh, there's Abraham Lincoln's great great grandchild. and they just hated it. And so, Peggy, it's pretty obvious that she was a lesbian, so she never was married. Bud had a vasectomy when he was in his early 30s. And then Lincoln Isham just never had children. He had a stepchild, and maybe that was enough for him. I don't know. But yeah, so the last Lincoln descendant was Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith, and he died in 1985.
It's sort of, oh man, it's so unfortunate. Tragic ending to the story.
It is, yeah. And but it's sad too. Like if you learn about them, particularly Bud and Peggy, we don't know as much about Link Isham because he was very quiet. But Um, Bud and Peggy they could not have cared less that they were related to Abraham Lincoln. They gave away Lincoln family stuff. They sold it. They destroyed it. They really couldn't have cared less. Lincoln Isham, he did care. He donated a lot of things to the Library of Congress, as did his mother before him. So it's sad how much more we could still know, but they didn't care. So we don't. I'm sure we'll never even know the kind of things they probably gave away, sold, or destroyed about their ancestors.